This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot.
Woo!
And the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time.
What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out of touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
This episode is brought to you by the world's first reposado from Tequila Herradura. Made with slow-cooked, hand-harvested agave sealed into oak barrels and aged 11 months. Before being enjoyed in your glass. Experience the world's first reposado. Tequila Herradura. Please drink responsibly. Responsibility.org. Tequila Herradura. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Brown-Forman, Louisville, Kentucky. Herradura is a registered trademark. Copyright 2025 Brown-Forman Corporation.
It's Wednesday, Adams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2, begins August 6th, only on Netflix.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon.
Hello?
That's the 1977 recording made by the so-called East Area Rapist, who enjoyed tormenting his victims before or after some of his attacks. Over the next 40-plus years, this unknown serial burglar, sexual predator, and serial killer would be responsible for dozens of rapes and murders up and down the state of California. Now, over time, law enforcement would piece together that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, the Golden State Killer were one and the same. But it wasn't until April 25th, 2018, it was revealed at a press conference that the Golden State Killer had finally been unmasked as James Joseph DeAngelo.
Yesterday afternoon, in a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph DeAngelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights. I can tell you that although it was DNA, ultimately, that led us down the right road, there were a lot of places that road could have led. I don't want to I can't underscore enough the absolute human factor, the dogged determination of not only the detectives working on this case, but the passion of the district attorney, myself, the community, and the victims. All too often we forget about talking about the victims. And today, we at least brought the first step towards closure for those victims of these horrendous crimes. So I want to thank not only the district attorney and the crime lab and the DNA that helped us get here, but my own detectives and the detectives from all of these folks represented by the leaders standing behind me. When we put together this working group 2 years ago and brought in the FBI, who was more than happy to be part of this team and effort, we had no way of knowing that we'd be standing here talking about the resolution of all of these crimes. So I have to thank them and again underscore the importance of the human factor and the dogged determination and passion of the individuals and human beings that led us down the right road to this individual today.
Ultimately, James Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. Here he is in court, speaking to the judge after listening to victim impact statements.
I've listened all your statements, each one of them, and I'm really sorry for everyone I've heard. Thank you, Your Honor.
DeAngelo would be sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. This week, we have a very special guest. Many of you probably have heard of Paul Holes and his investigative work on the Golden State Killer case, but trust me, there's so much more to know about him. You're listening to episode 92, an interview with special guest Paul Holes.
Why don't we start off with you saying your name and title, how you'd like me to refer to you in the podcast?
Well, my name is Paul Holes. My title has gotten a little confusing. I used to say I was a retired cold case investigator out of the Contra Costa County DA's office, which technically is still true, but I've recently been hired as a forensic investigator with the genealogy company Othram. So I am consulting with law enforcement across the nation on behalf of Othram to see if we can solve cases using the genealogy tool.
Wow. Is this like your dream job?
It's a good gig. It gets me back in the game, so to speak, because I, of course, retired and then for 6 years was, I was consulting with law enforcement here and there. And then for some of the true crime projects, notably some of the TV shows, I was working with law enforcement on their unsolved cases, but it still was spotty at best. So now I get the consistent exposure of doing casework, which I love. But I also, Othram has allowed me to continue doing the podcasts and the TV shows. And so I've got the best of both worlds. I can't complain.
Yeah, I wanted to talk with you because I've got my dog-eared copy of Unmasked, My Life Solving America's Cold Cases. I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but whenever I go into reading, I would consider this like a memoir, right? Is that what you would consider this? Yes. You never know what you're going to get. And you kind of have, I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you this, you kind of have a Boy Scout kind of vibe going, at least when I first. And so I think it was the first page. You were like, I'm in a strip club. Yeah. And so I knew then that this was going to be a really wild ride. And it was, a lot of it is about the Golden State Killer case, but you also talk about other cases that you worked. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Growing up, you watched Quincy and how that kind of informed your trying to figure out as you were a young man what you wanted to do.
Sure. I was probably, it was right around the 7th grade when I was watching Quincy. And I'm sure these were reruns, but I ended up becoming fascinated with how this forensic pathologist, Quincy, was utilizing, in essence, science to solve crimes. And as I went through high school and I was going to college and trying to assess what I wanted to do for a career, that show kind of resonated with me. And so I became kind of focused on trying to find a job within forensic science in order to utilize that. And I'd always had an interest in science and an aptitude for it. So my initial goal was to go to medical school and then specialize in forensic pathology. So it would have been a ton of education. Now that I've done my career, thank God I did not become a forensic pathologist. Because just spending every day in the morgue, cutting up bodies would kind of have worn on me pretty, badly. So I was fortunate that I found a forensic science position with the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office back in 1990, and then eventually became a deputy sheriff criminalist. So I became a sworn officer, but then was now, instead of just stuck in the lab, I was going out to the crime scenes. I was going to the morgue. So now I got that exposure, but I didn't have to live in the morgue, though for some cases it seemed like I was living in the morgue. And it was a much more well-rounded job as far as I'm concerned, because I was much more involved in the, violent crime cases. And eventually I kind of got bored with the laboratory work. And that's when I really started digging in investigatively, particularly on cold cases and serial predators. And so the Quincy show started me down the path. And then as I started down that path, I ended up just kind of going with the flow until I landed into a career that fit me and my personality.
Right. So I was getting the vibes of your personality when in your book, you talked about the taupe colored filing cabinet. Let me see what the quote is. This crime library that was hidden in plain sight. Like, that's not really what a lot of people would be like, yeah, this is this is what I'm doing. Like, and this kind of sneaking around that you did when you found the Golden State Killer, it was Ear. So kind of talk about that progression of finding the file cabinet and just diving in and just how that sparked it.
It really was started. My parents, my dad was military. He was stationed out in Bethesda, Maryland at the time. And this is, they bought me 2 books that they found in a bookstore out there in Maryland. And the 2 books, one was Crime and Human Nature, and then the other one was Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives. So could you imagine giving your child, sexual homicide related book? But that's what they gave me. And I voraciously consumed both books. And I just became fascinated with, the criminal mind as well as the serial predator. And for those that don't know, the book Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives is the book that the Netflix show Mindhunter is based off of. It's the academic book as a result of the studies that John Douglas, Bob Bressler, and Dr. Ann Burgess were doing, interviewing all these serial predators. So I was in that mindset of, I'm just fascinated with the serial killer, the serial rapist. And to your point about the library, I was kind of going in and just consuming all these books. This was an amazing library that the founding fathers of the Contra Costa County Criminalistics Laboratory, who a lot had connections to UC Berkeley, they created this library over the decades. And so I was reading all these books, and I noticed that taupe colored file cabinet in the corner that nobody ever went into. In fact, I don't think the drawers had been opened for, at this time, which is 1994, probably hadn't been opened for 15 years. It was just sitting in there collecting dust. And I just wondered what is inside that cabinet. And I just started opening up drawers. And there were some old cassette tapes in there and from conferences and stuff that the scientists had gone to. And then some other knickknacks, from over the decades in some of the other drawers. But the bottom drawer was heavy when I pulled on it. When I pulled it open, it was filled with these paper files with the manila file folders with the tabs on them. Mm-hmm. And each tab, and there was probably on the order of 40 to 50 different manila folders, each tab was labeled with a red EAR. And as I started digging into what was contained in each file, that's when I found out that this red EAR stood for East Area Rapist. And I started looking at some of the case files, and it became obvious that this was a serial rapist and a very brazen rapist based on the types of crimes he was committing, going into houses when a man was present and, binding the male up and then raping the woman there. And coming on the heels of just reading that book about serial predators, I was just instantly glued. Okay, this looks like it was a unsolved case back in the day, and I confirmed that at this time in 1994, it was still unsolved. And we were just starting to get the newfangled DNA technology into the lab, because previously we'd been doing ABO testing and protein testing, etc. Now, DNA, I thought, I wonder if I could possibly solve this case using this DNA technology. And so I started just digging into it. And so that's how I got the East Area Rapist case. Nobody ever assigned it to me. I did get permission from my boss to pursue the evidence. But in essence, that was my beginning in 1994 of a case that I spent 24 years on, which is now known as the Golden State Killer case.
I mean, that's like crazy, because it's like, did you ever wonder why you were doing it? Like I've often, I struggle this myself, and I'm not in law enforcement, but just when I made the transition into the true crime genre, it's like, why am I did a deep dive on the Green River Killer investigation and for the podcast, The Shadow Girls. And it's like, why am I doing this? And I happen to have a connection with, I've lived in the Pacific Northwest pretty much my entire life. And I lived close to where the Green River is, and the first 5 victims were found. Did you ever ask yourself, like, why, or feel guilty? Like, why?
Well, I can answer the why. Did I ever feel guilty? No. No. I don't do bored well. And so was always pursuing things that interested me because oftentimes, I've been in the forensic field at this point for 4 years, and was starting to bore a little bit, even though now I had a new assignment, and there were some exciting aspects of the new assignment. So finding the East Area Rapist files, it just fed an interest. And so it was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I don't care really, what anybody thinks about it. I'm going to start studying these cases. And it wasn't all the case files in the entire series. It was really those just in the Contra Costa County and some of the Central Valley cases. So I had a very incomplete picture at that moment in time about the series. But first and foremost, it was just like I'm latched onto this and I'm going to do it, even if I'm just doing it at home, which I did a lot of. The other thing, when I first started this, it was in many ways out of ego. It was, well, these original investigators couldn't solve it, and here I can come along and I can solve it. So that was kind of a lot of the initial thrust on that series, as well as any of these cold cases I've gotten involved with, is I always come in thinking that I can make a difference on the case, and I've kind of proven myself over and over again in that capacity. So there is an ego aspect to it. But one of the things that I think became very humbling, well, first is that, well, I just didn't solve it overnight.
No.
A quarter century. But as I started working these cases, not just from a science perspective, but truly investigating the cases, talking to the victims or the victims' families who, their loved one had been killed, it now became, oh, this is real. These are real people that were impacted, and I'm no longer just approaching this from an ego standpoint. There's a sense of responsibility because I'm a public servant, but also I ended up becoming friends with these victims or the families, and I felt the sense of obligation. So it really shifted, and that's part of a message that I like to put out there, is that oftentimes the people working in labs are so detached from the cases. It's just another piece of evidence. Whereas the reality is that they need to recognize they're real people that were impacted or lost their lives or were traumatized. And it's getting that message out to where now you have people who are so detached, but they care about the case. That is so important, because if you care about the case, you're going to put your best effort forward.
Right. And I think that part of the guilt aspect, I think you dealt with incredibly well and so relatable and authentic, is the idea of like, your first marriage, it kind of laid waste to your family life in the sense that you were so committed to this. I think that was really great that you articulated that so well, of the high cost that you've personally paid for the 24 years of this pursuit.
Yeah, this was not the intent of the book when I initially started to write it. The intent was a deep dive into the Golden State Killer investigation. And then when a writer, Robin, was brought on board to help me, with the book, and I'm telling her not only about the Golden State Killer case, but all these other cases that I worked during my career, she's like, oh my God, we got to incorporate that. And then during our collaboration, there were times when I was, I'm choking up, I'm breaking down as I'm talking to her about my career. And that's when the publisher really gravitated towards, your reader's going to want to know about you, not just the cases. And that was a hard sell because I'm a private person. And then to actually divulge a lot of very personal and intimate aspects of how my career impacted me and my personal relationships, the ongoing issues that I had to do some soul searching. And then when you start talking about the commitment to the job, this is where people, I don't think, I like to use this example. If you have a young daughter that goes missing, And the law enforcement professionals that are responsible for your daughter's case check out at 5 o'clock every day and go home and don't work on that case until 8 a.m. the next morning, you're going to be pissed. You're expecting more from the people that are looking for your daughter. And that's something that I don't think the general public truly understands, is that us that are working these cases, you're on the case 24/7. And that does come at a sacrifice of your personal life. And, for me, of course, I had my active cases, and where there was that 24/7, we got to get things going because somebody could end up dead if we don't find them, or they are dead and this person could be killing somebody else if we can't catch them fast enough. And then I also, with the cold cases, sometimes, I would obsess, like with Golden State Killer, but many other cases in which when I'm home, I'm at the dinner table, I'm not listening to the conversation. I'm thinking about the details of whatever case is in my mind, trying to figure out what's the next step I want to do, whether it's that night or in the morning when I go into work. And so, this kind of career path really does come at a personal sacrifice. And I didn't really recognize that. And it did have it's impacted my marriages, my relationships with my kids, but it also impacted me psychologically. And I didn't recognize until after I retired, and then just cratered at one point. And I was like, what is wrong with me? And so now I've become quite outspoken that we need to do a better job in law enforcement at addressing the types of negative experiences that the law enforcement professionals are dealing with. And it's not just the officer involved in the shooting. It's, the CSI that's walking in and there's a dead child inside the house. That is an injury to that CSI's psychology, to that CSI's mental health. And we're not addressing that by and large. So that's where this book, me opening up about myself has turned into a positive. I was so scared about it, but then it's turned into where now I've got law enforcement professionals thanking me. I've got therapists who are providing support to those of us like me, coming up to me and thanking me for at least exposing this, because us in law enforcement, we don't talk about this kind of thing. You can't show weakness. That's the culture, and I've kind of vomited forth my personal stuff, and it seems to have resonated. And so that's where I'm like, okay, I did the right thing. I made the right decision about, really opening up in the book.
Absolutely. Because that's when I was saying from the very beginning, I could tell this was going to be different. And honestly, I think that I'm happy to hear that you've had this response to the book, because, you could have committed 24 years of your life on something that didn't work out.
Oh, yeah.
You know what
Yeah, no, and there's other cases where I've worked as much on and it didn't work out, and that's, people, they look at me now and Golden State Killer got solved, because of me and the others that were part of this team that we cobbled together secretly in order to do something that had never been done before. But when I look at my career, I've got binders right next to me as I'm sitting here of cases that are still unsolved that I'm very passionate about, and so that's where that idea of, oh, I've got this success and I'm proud of the success, but when I look at my career, I look at those cases that are still hanging out there and that I failed on, and that's where the ego really kind of takes a hit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this case before a while ago, and I didn't realize, thanks to your book, I kind of had more insight into it, that you came up with a bunch of pushback from other law enforcement agencies, and this whole secret nature of not the entire thing, but even to the point where Michelle McNamara, who ended up giving you those crime scene photos or sharing those crime scene photos because she was able to speak with another agency and was able to sweet talk them for whatever she did, it worked, right? And she shared it with you. That was so sad beyond, it was just, talk a little bit about your relationship with Michelle and however you feel comfortable in sharing.
Sure. There was at the time, it was known as the East Area Rapists case. And we had a task force meeting, which was down in Santa Barbara, and Larry Poole from Orange County Sheriff's Office, he had been in communication with this true crime blogger, Michelle McNamara, and indicated that Michelle wanted to write an article about the East Area Rapist case and asked the task force if we were willing to cooperate. And we, I think, to a person in that room said, yes, it's time that this series, which is a huge, huge series, got some more public attention, because there had been some shows about it over the decades, but it just fizzled. Everybody just forgot about it real quick. So we agreed to talk to Michelle. And so Michelle ended up calling me, and I was in my car, and I pull over. And initially, just like, typically with journalists, I was in that very much just the facts, ma'am type of mentality, and answering her questions. But as we got talking, I could tell she had an in-depth knowledge of the case. It's like, oh, this is different, So Michelle and I, during that time, we were emailing, we were talking on the phone, and I had decided I was going to release some previously unreleased evidence to the public. This stuff called the homework evidence that I thought had been dropped by these East Area Rapists, hoping somebody would recognize that. But during this conversation, I started to get a little bit more trustworthy of Michelle. So I started to divulge off the record the thrusts of my investigations. And so when she ended up having her article,
which was a big thing for you.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Was huge.
Yeah, because this is where, not only am I concerned about what the other investigators on the East Area Rapist case would think if, they found out that I had been open with Michelle, but also it could be, it could impact my career, with the sheriff's office. So when Michelle's article came out in Los Angeles Magazine, and this is circa 2013, 2012, I don't remember exactly when, I was nervous because it was like, is this it? And I read the article, and I saw she didn't burn me. Anything I said, keep off the record. She kept off the record. So that's when, okay, I can trust this woman. And then the other thing about that article is, as she now said, this is no longer the East Area Rapist. This is the Golden State Killer. And I was just like, oh, you got to be kidding me. We don't need another moniker on this, because he had been known as East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, ear ons. And it was just like, well, what are you doing, Michelle? But turns out she was right by rebranding him with the Golden State Killer moniker, just because it's descriptive of what he was doing. And then now all of a sudden, after that article, the public became fascinated. And then Michelle was tasked with writing a book, and she asked my opinion if I would accept her writing a book, and if the other task force members would accept it. I thought, yeah, I think a bona fide book on this series is needed. We had a couple of original investigators that had put out their books, but it was really cops writing what was in the case file, So having a true writer, I thought, was a good thing. And it was during this time, as Michelle's writing the book, that our relationship really grew together. And in essence, she proved herself not only to be trustworthy, but to actually have a fairly sharp investigative mind, an attention to detail. She had a brilliant researcher that assisted her. And we, in essence, were helping each other investigate the case.
It seems like it was like an emotional connection too, because in the book you talked a lot about your first wife. You grew apart because you wanted to be sitting there talking about crime scenes and all that, and it was really hard for her to listen to that. She wasn't built to be, and I totally get that. And then your second wife, it sounds like, you bonded together over, many things, but she was a criminalist as well. So right. You really could, be sitting at a dinner table together talking about work. And like, I mean, it's hard. As I have a hard time with small talk myself. So I totally related to that. And it's like really specific what you do and talk about. And so it's hard to do surface when that's what your mind's thinking about. And Michelle was like, you two were, I could picture you guys being able to support each other in that way. You know, you're willing to put your freaking career on the line, basically, and trusting her.
No, no, for sure. You know, and in some ways, yeah, she did become an outlet because I became so focused on the Golden State Killer case. The dinner time conversation, you know, my second wife, she ended up just rolling her eyes at me because it was just constant, right? And so with Michelle, she was as obsessed as I was. You know, you should see our email threads. I mean, these are,
I can imagine.
They went on. I mean, at a certain point, I would just cut the thread because now it was like an encyclopedia on a certain aspect of the case. I'm going, this is becoming, it's so cumbersome. You know, you got 100 different, you know, entries into this thread back and forth. And so we'd have to start a new one, you know, and so there was definitely an intellectual connection. There was an emotional connection. You know, in many ways, she was the one person that, you know, she didn't ride shotgun in my car as I was investigating the case, but in essence, she was my true investigative partner for the 3 years that I knew her. And, you know, that was where I absolutely bonded. And it ended up being, you know, when she tragically passed away while she was asleep, how it was just absolutely devastating to me. It was like losing a loved one. And, you know, it was absolutely purely a platonic relationship, but it was a friendship for sure, as well as a professional relationship. And, you know, her book, ultimately, she hadn't completed her book when she passed away. And the book's title is I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which I'm sure many of your listeners have either read or they've watched the HBO series on. I still can't bring myself to read her book. I've never read it.
That makes me want to cry right now, because when you said at the end of the chapter, I think you ended the chapter with, now I need to solve this for Michelle too. Like that really spoke to the friendship that you and she had shared. And I'm really sorry for your loss on that, because she was amazing. But let's talk about what happened after that, because it's unfortunate that she didn't get to see the fruits of your labor.
Right, right. So, you know, after Michelle passed, I was in a tailspin, you know, emotionally, and also investigatively. I had told Michelle the last time I saw her, I had a really good, strong suspect. And I thought he was the best suspect. And quite frankly, I was convinced he was the guy. And ended up getting a surreptitious DNA sample. The FBI out of Sacramento helped me with that and then eliminated him. And I was crushed. And I was just like, what am I doing? You know, it's been at this point almost 23 years. I think at that point I've been involved in the case and had numerous periods of excitement only to have that, you know, elimination and you know, this roller coaster ride of emotions. And so I essentially almost just pushed away from the case. I just couldn't muster up the zest to continue, even though I was so obligated to the victims that I now knew as friends and the family members. And I did not know, I thought I had exhausted every avenue that I could think of. And then I just had, this would have been February of 2017, completely unrelated case. 2002 homicide, Asian female found buried underneath her house under kitty litter. And ultimately, her live-in boyfriend, who we knew as Larry Vanner, was arrested, and he confessed to this homicide. And part of this Larry Vanner's past was 1986. He had been arrested for abandoning a 6-year-old girl, this Lisa Jensen. And we proved, he had said that he was her father and that mom had died in a traffic accident in Texas. Well, we proved he was not her biological father with DNA. So I and this Roxanne Grunheid, who was a friend of mine, homicide investigator with Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office, We spent 15 years trying to identify Lisa because we're sure she was abducted from somewhere and she's a missing girl from somewhere. Then her parents and family want her back. We could never figure out who she was. She was alive. She was an adult woman. She just had no memory of where she had come from. And then I get a call in that February of 2017, and that's Roxanne saying, "Get over here. Lisa's been identified." So I get over to her office, which is across town, and on the phone is Detective Peter Headley from San Bernardino Sheriff's Office. And he proceeds to tell us they identified Lisa as this Dawn Bodin out of New Hampshire. And, the kind of on a side note, Larry Vanner turns out to be Terry Rasmussen, who is responsible for the Bear Brook homicides out of New Hampshire, the bodies in a barrel. Huge case out on the East Coast. And so I'm asking Peter Headley, how did you do this? How did you identify Lisa? And that's when he said, I used a website called DNAadoption.com and a genealogist by the name of Barbara Ray Venter. And he goes, has something to do with centimorgans, this and that. And I was like, this. And as I'm driving back, I'm thinking, I wonder if this technology that was used to identify Lisa could be used to identify an unknown offender like the Golden State Killer. So as soon as I get in my office, I call up Barbara and don't tell her what case I'm working. I just say, it's a big case. Do you think this could be used? And she's told me, I see no reason why it couldn't.
You lose weight, it comes back. Then you lose it again, and it comes back again with a vengeance. If this cycle sounds familiar to you, there's a better, more sustainable way to lose weight. What if you could take a weekly shot to shed those pounds and keep them off? If you've heard of Ozempic or Wegovy, then you've probably heard three things. They're effective, but expensive, and they're in high demand, which means they're hard to get. But you're in luck because there's Ro. Through Ro, you can access prescription compounded GLP-1s with the same weight loss ingredient as brand name GLP-1s at a fraction of the cost. Not only does Ro have compounded GLPs in stock right now, but Ro members also receive support throughout their entire process. Which means if you're eligible for medication, you can have access to your provider on demand for any questions. And Ro makes it super easy to see if you qualify from the comfort of your own home. This means no scheduling a doctor's appointment, no commute into that doctor appointment, and no waiting rooms. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in 1 to 4 days. And because you're a Criminal Mischief listener, we're going to save you some money. Go to ro.co/mischief. That's MISCHIEF. Memberships start at just $99 for your first month. Medication costs are separate. That's ro.co/mischief. Go to ro.co/safety for black box warning and full safety information. Compounded medication is not required to and does not receive FDA review or approval, RX only. This message is sponsored by Greenlight. Summertime is supposed to be an opportunity to slow down, but around this time of year, in many ways, it feels like time is moving faster. My kids are going to be starting a new grade soon. They're a little older and taller and hopefully wiser. At least that's the plan. To make sure my kids are covered over the summer when they're hanging out with their friends or participating in activities, I look to Greenlight as a way to stay connected with my kids while at the same time helping to grow their independence. Greenlight is really cool because it's a debit card and money app for families. A place where parents can keep an eye on kids' spending and money habits while kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely. But there's also Greenlight's Infinity Plan, which comes with all the financial literacy education. Essentially, it's a really valuable source for millions of parents and kids. Plus, and here's the bonus, there's also built-in safety features to give you peace of mind. With Greenlight Infinity, teens can check in without actually needing to check in, thanks to family location sharing. And in a worst-case scenario, they can also call for help when they need it, with SOS alerts that connect them to family members, 911, or both. There's even a feature that detects car crashes and will connect your young drivers to 911 dispatch and alert emergency contacts if needed. So no matter which features make the most sense for your household, Greenlight is the easy, convenient way for parents to raise financially smart kids and for families to navigate life together. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/mischief. That's MISCHIEF. That's greenlight.com/mischief to try Greenlight for free. Greenlight.com/mischief.
Hey, it's Sydney Sweeney. I'm not here to tell you to buy American Eagle jeans. And I definitely won't say that they're the most comfortable jeans I've ever worn. Or that they make your butt look amazing. Why would I need to do that? But if you said that you want to buy the jeans, I'm not going to stop you. But just so we're clear, this is not me telling you to buy American Eagle jeans.
Sydney Sweeney, Hasbro jeans.
You see what I did there, right?
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
It took a while just to even confirm that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same before they were considered two offenders. And then you had the DNA, but it was just rattling around in CODIS for like 10 years, right? And so now nobody was doing this. This was kind of new.
Right. Yeah, and I was the one that made the connection, East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker, back in 2001, using the conventional forensic DNA testing. And then that Golden State Killer profile had been up in CODIS since 2001. So now we're talking 2017. We're talking almost 2 decades. DNA didn't solve the Golden State Killer case at that point. And we had done international searches. We had familial searches done within California, and it just wasn't working. And so now there's this DNA-based technology that Barbara had used to identify Lisa that was utilizing a special type of genealogy tool. And it had been employed primarily for adoptees to discover who their biological parents were. So that's where, that's what DNAadoption.com was doing. So this is where, at this point, and I had tried to communicate with Barbara after that initial phone call, and she wasn't answering. I was like, okay, here's a genealogist that doesn't want to help law enforcement. And I was fortunate that an FBI, he's actually a lawyer, general counsel out of the Orange County office, called me up. His name's Steve Kramer. And he had heard, I'd given an update at the Sacramento Golden State Killer Task Force meeting saying, I've got an older type of genealogy that I've been pursuing, but I've got this new type of genealogy. I don't know exactly how it works, but I've reached out to this Barbara. So I had given that update. Well, Kramer had heard about that. And so he had called me up and says, I believe in what you're doing. How can I help? And this was a huge turning point. So now I had a bulldog of a person with the FBI level authority. And I was an FBI task force officer, but he had that, career FBI aspect to him. Plus he was a lawyer. So he knew all the ins and outs of the legalities of the various things that we ultimately did. And we teamed up and we started going down this path, recognizing this is how this case can be solved.
What you're talking about for the layman, I think, is that there were issues with sharing the profile with a genealogist, right? Is that what you're talking about in terms of needing the beefed up bulldog or?
No, the genealogy community, they really are protective of these genealogy DNA databases because the people in these databases, from their perspective, they're putting their DNA profiles in these databases for their own purposes, not to solve crime. So, right. To utilize these resources from their philosophy was in some ways a violation. So that's, something that was a hurdle that we had to deal with. And then Kramer ended up befriending Bennett Greenspan over family tree DNA. And that was huge because Bennett ended up thinking this is a good thing. So he allowed us to be able to utilize family tree DNA's capabilities, both from a lab standpoint as well as a database standpoint, to work on the case. But first we had to get DNA from the Golden State Killer from out of evidence. And I had consumed everything I had in my jurisdiction out of Contra Costa County. So I had to rely on the Southern California agencies and their homicide evidence to find one of those agencies who would be willing to have some of their incredibly valuable DNA evidence, used in this novel technology. Because each time you do a DNA analysis, you consume some of that DNA evidence. And that's where, like I had done, you can get to where you don't have anymore, and then you're kind of SOL if new technologies come down the pipe. And that's when I end up going on this, this road show, this dog and pony show, where I'm talking to these agencies, and Kramer's involved with this. And it's like, this is what this is. And there's a lot of technical stuff, and I really didn't even need any more DNA. I just needed a phone call to be made to a laboratory that had done a facial composite based off of DNA testing. And the agency that had sent that evidence in essence, wasn't willing to do that phone call. And then eventually I had Irvine PD was willing to provide me a DNA sample from their case, the Janelle Cruz case. But then the DA over that jurisdiction called up the police chief and said, no, don't cooperate with Kramer and Holes. And so we were like, okay, we're now seeing the politics involved in this.
Did this just make you want to do it even more, or were you frustrated? Like, what were you feeling during this time? I mean, that's like so maddening.
Yeah, and there were some other people that were trying to talk me out of it, and it was just like, no, I knew, because of my science background, I knew this was a powerful tool before we ever even used it. So it was very frustrating, but we also ended up realizing we have to go covert, and I talk about it in the book, but in essence, now nobody else, even in the task force, knew what we were doing, so we were just going, okay,
you had to go covert because you didn't want to be stopped?
Yes, absolutely. And we were fortunate that Ventura County, that DA and the lead investigator, the Steve Rhodes, so DA Totten and Steve Rhodes were like, absolutely, we are interested. And turns out they had DNA evidence from the Golden State Killer case that they didn't even know they had. It turns out when I had gone down and I presented what the technology was, and this is what I needed in order to be able to pursue it, they start digging into their evidence, and Steve Rhodes from Ventura County finds out that the coroner's office, the pathologist back in 1980, had collected not one, but 2 sexual assault kits. Well, one kit was turned over to investigators, and of course, over the decades, it had been analyzed and reanalyzed, and all that DNA is being consumed. The second sexual assault kit, coroner's office kept themselves. It was still in coroner's evidence, sealed up. So that ends up getting sent to the Ventura Crime Lab, and they come back and they have boatloads of Golden State Killer DNA off of Charlene Smith's sexual assault swabs. I mean, to a point where they're going to give me so much of this evidence. I was like, I in good conscience can't take that much DNA. Give me this. This is what I need. And for those forensic scientists out there at the time, it was 200 nanograms of this sperm DNA from the Golden State Killer case. And I can tell you right now, the DNA analysts that are listening to this, they've probably just choked, because 200 nanograms is a huge amount of DNA. But that was what the genealogy technology needed at the time in order to be able to generate this genealogy compatible DNA profile. So this is the stroke of luck. We're pursuing it. I mean, this was something that was a purposeful thing, so it wasn't a lucky find in terms of the utilizing the tool. The luck was, oh my God, we have a ton of DNA we did not even know existed because of what
Because
this
didn't they not keep the rape kits for after 8 years or something? Wasn't that?
Well, that's, for straight sexual assaults. If it's just a rape case, that's right. Depending on the state. California, it was 6 years at the time. But this was a homicide case. You keep that evidence forever. So that's why, Northern California, the East Area Rapist attacks, which were rape cases, all the agencies except mine had destroyed their sexual assault kits, had destroyed all the evidence collected because it was past the statute of limitations for that crime. Southern California was the resource for the DNA evidence because they were homicide cases. That's why I was going down south, because I needed to convince one of those agencies, give me some of your valuable homicide DNA evidence so I can move and do this genealogy. And Ventura was the one that stepped up, and ultimately that was the DNA that was used to solve the Golden State Killer case.
So now, I can't remember, I think it was in the early pages of your book, you talked about going and sitting in front or near or around his house before it came back that this was the guy, right?
Yeah, so
it's like you can't just sit still, like you said. And you're sitting there thinking, am I blowing this? Is he going to see me? Especially knowing that he was a cop at one time.
Well, that was where, Barbara had re-engaged, and she gave us the guidance. There was a team of 6 of us, including Barbara, that were doing the genealogy tool. And then ultimately, multiple men that had California connections during the time frame of the homicides or the sexual assaults kind of popped up, and then it's just straight investigations as to who these men are. And I really glommed onto a guy that was living in Colorado at the time, and then he was eliminated. And then Monica from SAC-DA's office, Monica Tchaikovsky, an amazing kind of researcher in her own right, she sent out an email to me and her lieutenant, Kirk Campbell, and it was this Joseph D'Angelo, who was at the time of the article was had been an Auburn police officer. Auburn is a city that's about an hour north of Sacramento. And I looked at it going, I can't believe a full-time law enforcement officer could be committing all these crimes. And it wasn't I'm disregarding him as a suspect because he was a cop. No, because we looked at plenty of cops over the course of the series. It was just like, I don't see how he would have the time to do all of this. But I end up doing, the standard, well, let's see who this guy is. And I'm, pulling his DL, I'm doing my TLO on him, I'm running his criminal history, I'm looking at his registered firearms, and certain geographic connections were adding up. And Monica had found a newspaper article where he had been engaged to a Bonnie, and we have a case in the series. It was a Davis attack in July of 1978, where the East Area Rapist, as he's literally raping the woman, he's on top of her, he is sobbing and he's saying, I hate you, Bonnie, I hate you, Bonnie, over and over again. So we always knew the East Area Rapist / Golden State Killer had a Bonnie that was significant. We just didn't know what the relationship was. So now here's this D'Angelo with a Bonnie in his past, and he never married her. So obviously it was a relationship that went sideways.
Is that the moment when you're thinking, I mean, that would pretty much be an aha moment. I mean, that's not, it feels like you would think that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, but I had other suspects that had either been married to or dated Bonnies. One suspect,
really?
Yeah, one suspect had pulled a gun on his wife, Bonnie, and raped her at gunpoint, and eliminated him. So this is where sort of like I'm looking at this circumstantial evidence. I'm going, well, there's some boxes being checked, but I've been here before. Yeah. And that's when I decided he had enough. He was worth some legwork on, and he had been fired by Auburn Police Department back in 1979 because he had shoplifted dog repellent and a hammer out of Citrus Heights. So Sacramento Sheriff's Office at the time had actually arrested him, and then the police chief had fired him, this Nick Willick. And I thought, well, I'm going to see if this Nick Willick is still alive, but he was a police chief back in the late 70s. Chances are he's not alive. I call up Auburn Police and I'm talking to a detective saying, hey, I'm looking into this old case. this Nick Willick, fired him. Is there any chance he's still around? And he goes, oh, I know Nick. He's in here all the time. And I was just blown away. It turns out he was the youngest police chief in the nation at the time. He was a very young police chief. So I end up talking to Nick, and he doesn't know a case I'm looking at. I just said, this Joe D'Angelo came up. Do you remember him? He goes, oh, yeah, Joe, I was his sergeant, before I promoted up to police chief. And he starts talking about how D'Angelo was kind of a shoddy cop and didn't have good safety practices and this and that. And then at one point, after D'Angelo, Internal Affairs was doing their investigation after the arrest, D'Angelo's rep had called up the chief and said, D'Angelo has threatened to kill you. I thought, well, that's interesting, but it's a contentious employer-employee relationship. So I thought, well, that's not anything unusual, but it's something I noted. Mm-hmm. But then Nick tells me, the police chief tells me, he goes, yeah, Paul, when D'Angelo was on admin leave, in the middle of the night, my daughter comes into my room and says, Dad, there's a man standing outside my bedroom window shining a flashlight in. So Nick goes out, try to find this man, doesn't see him. He had a house that no yard in the back, a brand new house, hadn't been landscaped. He says, Paul, there is shoe impressions all around the back perimeter of my house. And he goes, I know that was D'Angelo. And I thought, that's exactly what the Golden State Killer would do in this situation. So that's when D'Angelo became a prime suspect in my mind. And that's when I was now going to retire. I was within a few days after Nick told me that of retiring. And so my last day before I had to turn in my badge and gun, I was like, well, he's a prime suspect. This D'Angelo guy, I got to go see where he lives, because that's what I always did with my prime suspect. So I drive from the Bay Area up to Citrus Heights, and I park on the curb on the other side of the street from D'Angelo's house. His car's in the driveway. I know he's there, and I'm looking. I never saw him. And I just thought, well, what's the likelihood he's the Golden State Killer killer? And I thought, because I had so many of these guys that I was sure that had, quite frankly, stronger circumstantial evidence pointing at them than D'Angelo. But you know what? Probably the last good thing I can do is just knock on the door, introduce myself, and eventually say, hey, Joe, you're former cop, you know how it is. If I can just get a voluntary DNA sample, I'll eliminate you from this, and you won't have anybody else knocking on your door in the future. And so I really thought about doing that. Then as I sat there and I thought, no, he has this going and this going and this, but there's too much pointing at him. I don't want to blow it. And so eventually I just put my car in drive, and I drove away. And the next day I'm literally turning my badge and gun in. I was an FBI task force officer, so I had to go to the FBI field office and be debriefed, and they took what's called their creds back, my FBI ID and things. And
to be like super emotional for you, because you talked about it, of course, in the book, but since I'm talking to you now, you have a really great prime suspect that's looking real good. You're going to his house, which is what you do, right? If you feel good enough about it, and then you're turning your stuff in.
Yeah.
And
it was tough, and this is where, I wanted to solve the Golden State Killer case before I retired. And I didn't do that. And then now, I'm driving home. I have a junior investigator driving me back to my house in Vacaville, and I've got a little cardboard box that has, my family portraits and my spoon and my dish, out of my office, So after 27 and a half years as, being in law enforcement in Contra Costa County in a variety of capacities, that was sort of the very, well, it's over. And
was there any part of you that thought, maybe I won't retire? Maybe I'll tell him that I want to re-up. Did you?
No, this was a decision I'd made 6 months prior, and it's a financial decision. The way the pension system is set up, it really encourages you to retire. And I, as much as I enjoyed the casework, the working within the county, all the other duties I had worn on me, because I was a high level administrator. I was division commander within the sheriff's office. I was the chief of forensics within the DA's office, and I managed, homicide and sexual assault. All these investigators were underneath me. So I had personnel issues I was dealing with. I had to redo the entire DA's budget, leading up to the arrest of or to my retirement as we we're, hunting for D'Angelo. I was done with that. But fortunately,
I think that's what was so fun for me is you were like, when you got this like prestigious managerial job basically within it, and you're like, now I can do whatever I want without anybody. I can go work on my cold cases. I mean, it's just really funny, for anybody who has a passion. I mean, this can translate into anything. It resonates with people. If you're, an athlete, if you're, want to be a tech billionaire or whatever, like just the drive that it actually takes to be thinking about it all the time, working on it all the time. Like you're not thinking like other people, I guess is what I'm saying. And I appreciated that, now I can do what I really want to do.
Yeah. And at least, because I had to sneak around with the sheriff's office. My commander didn't know where I was most of the time. When I'm literally halfway across the state, and he's thinking I'm sitting in my office. And when I went over to the DA's office, at least I had freedom, and that in essence was a huge step for me, because now I really could go out and not worry about my boss finding out that I'm sneaking out and doing this. But when I talk to people, about career choices, I took risks, and I really encourage people, will take risks. Don't be insubordinate, or do some of the things I did would probably have cost me my job. But it's at the same time, because I took risks, the Golden State Killer case got solved, and it was the work that I did, the work that Steve Kramer did, the other team members, Barbara bringing in her expertise. But we would not have been there to do this unless I hadn't taken the risks in the decades that I had before.
Yeah, I think that's why I love it so much, because I think in any kind of pursuit of this magnitude, you have to take risks. You have to care to the point where you're on the brink, even in your own personal life. And I don't mean that negatively. I just mean it's a reality, right? I mean, it is a reality. So I appreciated that. So let's get to got your box, they bring you home. You're like about ready to have a breakdown. Basically, it's like your whole world is turning upside down. And then, dun.
So yeah, the part of the story, and it may seem somewhat trivial, but it actually is significant, is I had to retire kind of a day early, or I had to use a vacation day and leave a day earlier, because Megyn Kelly wanted to do a show about this unsolved Golden State Killer case out in New York. And two of the victims, Jane Carson, who was raped by the East Area Rapist back in 1976, and then Debbie Domingo, whose mother had been killed by the Golden State Killer down in Santa Barbara, were going to be part of the show. And so I said, yes, if the victims are part of that show, I'm there to support them. And we do the show, and then we go out to dinner. And I'm talking to Debbie and Jane, and they're saying, so, is this case ever going to get solved? And I just told them, there's an Auburn cop, and he's looking good. It's possible we may have an answer in a couple weeks. Could be a couple years. But yes, this case is going to get solved. And so I fly back, and had already made the decision to move to Colorado Springs. So my wife and I fly out for a week to shop for houses. And during that time, I'm getting constant updates, because D'Angelo is under surveillance by Sac Sheriff and the FBI to get a surreptitious DNA sample. And so they're giving me an update of what D'Angelo had done during the day. And this is something that I am so thankful for, is that even though I'm retired, my peers that I worked with recognized I was valuable to the investigation, and basically kept me in the game as they were looking at D'Angelo. So I'm getting these updates, and then eventually my wife and I put an offer on the house that I'm sitting in. And we go to P.F. Chang's to celebrate the purchase of the house. And I get my phone lights up, and it's Lieutenant Kirk Campbell from the SAC DA's office. I go, here's another update. So I step outside into the snow, and typically Kirk will say, "Hey, Paul, how's it going? Blah, blah, this is what's been going on today." As soon as I say, "Hey, Kirk," he goes, "Paul, you can't tell anybody anything." I was like,
You knew
okay.
something's good.
And then he goes, "I don't know what it means, but the lab is excited." And he wasn't at the time. He was not a DNA guy. I said, "Well, what did the lab tell you?" He goes, "We got a sample and it's matching across 21 markers." And I was like, "Kirk, it's him." And so I was saying, "Do you need me to come back now?" And he goes, "No, the DA wants another sample because the first sample they got, which was off of D'Angelo's car door handle when he went into Hobby Lobby, it was a mixed sample. There was a minor DNA profile mixed with the major profile, and the major was matching Golden State Killer. So the DA says, I want what we call a single source sample. So I fly back, and that's when trash day for D'Angelo's neighborhood is going to be, forget if it was a Monday or Tuesday. I drive up to SAC Sheriff's Homicide, and Ken Clark, who is the SAC homicide sergeant on the case, and I lock ourselves in his office, and we author the arrest warrant for D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer. I also provide information to another investigator about the search warrant aspects, because that's huge. We got 56 cases with all sorts of evidence that you have to articulate in this massive search warrant.
How many pages was that? Like 100 or?
Oh, in fact, I don't even know how long it was. In fact, I'm not sure I ever saw the final search warrant document. I was so focused on having to construct the arrest warrant because we had to employ a pretty interesting strategy on how to articulate the connection of Ventura homicides to East Area rapist DNA from Contra Costa County to MO-based connections to Sacramento to an MO-based double homicide up in Sacramento. So we could connect a Ventura homicide to a Sacramento homicide, and now Sacramento had reason to seek an arrest warrant.
There's no way they could have cut you out of this. They had to call you up.
So I felt that I did contribute, yes. And but anyways, they end up doing a trash grab on D'Angelo. He pushed his trash out on the out off the curb, and trash was grabbed, and they got like 12 items out of it. And the last item that they chose, which was a piece of tissue, like Kleenex tissue, turns out had some snot in it, and it was 100% Golden State Killer. And so that's when now the arrest warrant is taken to the judge by Ken Clark. He gets it signed, and the arrest team is now positioned. And we're back at SAC Homicide listening to the radio traffic, and it looked like D'Angelo, this is in the evening, and D'Angelo is about to button down his house and go inside for the night based on his patterns from the previous week while he was under surveillance. And they did not want to sit on that house another night. They didn't want, and this was a significant officer safety issue. His daughter and grandchild were living in the house with him. There was a concern that if things went awry during an arrest, that he could take his family hostage. So the hope was that he would drive away from the house and he would be arrested. Well, that didn't happen. So now the decision was made. He needs to be arrested at the house. And at a certain point, he goes over to he's out in his front yard, and he goes to the side of the house up by the fence where there's no gate. And so now he's kind of isolated himself from the ability to kind of just quickly run inside. And then that's when the arrest team engages. And it goes quiet. Basically we hear the commander basically go, and then the radio drops silent for what seemed like forever. And then we get the commander coming on saying, "Suspect in custody." And literally everybody cheering, there's high fives.
Did you hear that?
So, I heard, a suspect in custody. And of course, now I've seen the video of D'Angelo. He's arrested, he's being put into the van. Ken Clark is actually going into the van, and you hear D'Angelo make the famous statement, I've got a pot roast, I've got a roast in the oven, or something like that. But, that was where, even though there was celebration, it was like, well, this is just the start, because now he needs to be interviewed. And that's when Ken and I had developed a strategy where Ken was going to go in and talk to him about the Sacramento-based attacks, including the double homicide of Katie and Brian Maggiore, hoping to get admissions to that. And then I was going to team up with Ken to talk about the Central Valley and East Bay cases that I had a lot of expertise in. And then the Southern California agencies who had the homicides would be allowed to go in and talk to him. But he never, with Ken in there, he never engaged with him. He never gave any answers. And due to certain statements where there was concern that he might invoke and, ask for an attorney, that's when I kind of got aced out of an opportunity of talking to DeAngelo directly. And homicide investigators from Southern California were allowed to go in, and DeAngelo did the same thing. He never gave any statements, and that was the end. He was taken off to jail. I went home to get a few hours of sleep, and then I was able to go into DeAngelo's house first thing in the morning and take a look at how he was living, made some observations, made some recommendations to the CSI teams that would be searching the house, and then went to the press conference where we announced to the world that Joseph DeAngelo was identified as the Golden State Killer and my life hasn't been the same since.
How much did you want to interview this guy? Like, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, like how disappointed? I mean,
I was so disappointed, but it would not have mattered who was in the room, because I had developed, it was a bifurcated strategy. And from my perspective, it was, well, how does DeAngelo self-identify? So you think about another notorious serial killer, Dennis Rader. He was married, had kids, president of his church, active in his son's Boy Scouts. He looks like the epitome of a family man. But when he's arrested, he went, that's all a facade. I'm BTK. He identified as a serial killer. Well, that is informative. Well, okay, you're proud of what you've done. This is how this interview is going to go. With DeAngelo, as he goes, yeah, I'm the Golden State Killer. Then that informs the investigators how to approach that interview. And you have to, think on your feet because you don't know going into it. But if DeAngelo's like the doting grandfather and he truly loved his family, then that is how you would deviate how you would approach and interact with him. So I had my thoughts with this bifurcated strategy on how I would go down either path, depending on how DeAngelo was responding to us, and never got that opportunity. And quite frankly, now, and people might be shocked, DeAngelo, I truly believe, identifies as the family man, as the father, as the grandfather. He is not wanting to be known as the Golden State Killer. And
he never talked, he never confessed, he never said anything.
No, he never did.
I mean, that's just gotta, because, having one of your favorite books being written by Douglas and Burgess and Ressler, what could be gleaned from, it just puts the kibosh on that, which we don't even know if that's something that he wants to keep all this to himself like they do. And it's like they're trophies in his own mind. Or like what, or if he just identifies as this grandparent and he doesn't want to say, I guess we'll never know because he'll never talk.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not outside the world of possibilities that at some point he might talk. And I'm, of course, am highly interested in being able to go in and talk to him, as are some of the other investigators. And, we all have questions, and it's not so much of the why. It's the how, and what we can glean from a very intelligent, sophisticated, well-trained predator and how he selected his victims, how he approached, the crime scene, how he left, what was his mindsets, what kind of surveillance did he do? That is what I think can help in other cases. It's up to the psychologist to dig into well, why did you do this? What kind of fantasies did you have? Blah, blah, blah. But there's a possibility that he might talk in the future. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that.
Have you ever reached out to him and said, I'd like to talk to you?
I can't comment on that.
Paul!
So That one I
Okay,
can't comment.
you just did comment on it. I hope that you can break through. I mean, that would be great. I mean, you've definitely earned if anybody should be talking to him,
I think when you think about it, the fact that he's been silent so long since his arrest, that really speaks. He doesn't have the ego of identifying as a serial predator. He never wanted to be caught. He never wanted the notoriety of being the Golden State Killer or the East Area Rapist. I personally think that he had, in some ways, shelved that part of his life. In fact, his daughters didn't even know that he had been a cop, when he was, back. I mean, they were born after he had been fired, but you'd think just family history, the family would have told them, and they never were told that detail about his life. And I do think he identifies as that family man, the father, the grandfather.
Didn't he though reach out to the police like once or twice, basically baiting them, saying, you're never going to catch me, or did he do that?
we have some recordings, but we can't prove that was him. There was a lot of, if you want to call copycat type of people. In fact, there was even a rape case that was a copycat case where the guy tried to replicate the East Area Rapist MO. And that case was on the original list of East Area Rapist attacks for a brief period before Sacramento was able to identify the actual rapist. And he admitted, I was just trying to, copy the ear or the East Area Rapist. So the phone calls coming in, it's hard to say if any of them were actually D'Angelo. We do know, though, that D'Angelo called his victims after the attack. And we have one recording from the very first official East Area Rapist attack that occurred in June of 76. He called that victim in January of 1978, and she was able to record it. And so that's out there. That's available. So you can hear this man talk, hissing. He's like doing the heavy breathing, stupid little phone threat type of thing. But then he starts hissing, to this victim, in essence, that he's going to kill her.
I mean, that gives a little bit of insight into him psychologically in terms of like the LISK, the Long Island serial killer, how he would contact his victims, family members, just to, I guess, relive what he'd done.
This is, and this is I like D'Angelo is not a physical sadist. He's a psychological sadist. He enjoys inflicting fear, hearing fear. That's what he gets off on. And that's part of what he gets off on. And so you do have a class of offenders that, even though they have physically committed violence against victims or, killed the victim, and then they reach out to the family members, they get off on instilling that fear all over again. So D'Angelo is like that, and one victim who he attacked in 1977, after I had linked the East Area Rapist series to the original Night Stalker series, and the Sacramento Bee newspaper has an article about this linkage. That now the ear was also a serial killer, not just a rapist.
That was like in 2012, right?
This was in 2001.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so in April of 2001, the Sacramento Bee has an article. The next day, one of his victims that he attacked in 1977 receives a call from him, and he basically says, "Remember when we played?" And so she tracked her down. She had remarried, different last name, moved all the way across town. Her phone number was listed in the phone book under her new husband's name, not her name. Yet he had kept track of her. So that's the scary part, is that he probably was keeping track of multiple of his prior victims. In fact, one victim was 5-6 years after she was attacked. He called her at work. She was working as a waitress at Denny's. And he must have been a customer. I guarantee he was a customer and saw one of his victims working there, and probably walked across the street to a payphone and called the Denny's, and ended up doing, like the typical phone threat type of thing, with sexual innuendos.
I mean, that's like so terrifying. What year do they believe that he stopped?
Well, I believe he stopped after he killed Janelle Cruz in May of 1986. He had been very consistent, from Visalia Ransacker starting in 1974, all the way up to the Domingo Sanchez double homicide in Santa Barbara. in July of 81. You know, pretty routine with some gaps here and there, just a few months, or when he started committing homicides, he went biannual. And all of a sudden for 5 years, we have nothing. And I'm confident there's probably not going to be anything found that we can tie to him during those 5 years. And then he kills 19-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine. I think that he probably psychologically had stopped after the July 81 attack, and 6'3" Gregory Sanchez got into a physical fight with him. And D'Angelo left that crime scene in a panic. And there's evidence that I can show why I believe that. And I think, just like Dennis Rader said, he got into a fight with a male that he wasn't expecting in a house, and he walked out going, I could have been hurt, I could have been caught, I could have been killed. I'm done. And Rader talks about being older. Well, D'Angelo in 1981 is an older offender and gets into a fight with a male. And so he doesn't offend again for 5 years. And it's important when he kills Janelle Cruz, there's no male present. And D'Angelo, he had a strong preference to having males present during his attacks. So I think he has this one off on Janelle for whatever reason. And then after that, I don't think there's going to be any other case that could be tied to him. So I think he stopped in 1986.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that just people I've talked to, my co-host and I were actually talking about this, and he's like, yeah, they never stop. And I think that maybe people, I think they do stop. And that mindset is changing, where people think, oh, serial killers can't stop.
That's a myth. In fact, the FBI's behavioral analysts have come out and have said that is a myth. Think about a case you're very familiar with, Gary Ridgway. He killed 48 women in a 2-year span. What happened? And when he was being interviewed, he talked about, I think it was Mary Ellen O'Toole, the FBI profiler, is interviewing him. And part of, well, why did you stop? And Gary just goes, I got married. His life changed, right? That's what these predators, their lives do change. What happens in their personal life impacts their ability to commit crimes. Some of these predators do age out. Men, as we get older, our hormones change, our ability to commit some of the physical aspects of the crime, like with D'Angelo, the hopping the fences that he did, and, having deputies chasing him. As he's getting older, he's recognizing he can't physically do the types of crimes that he's very good at. Mm-hmm. Dennis Rader stopped. D'Angelo stopped, Ridgway stopped. They may have fantasized about other cases. There may have been a one-off in there, but the volume of cases absolutely stopped in all three instances. And I think that that's probably more common than what people think. It's an absolute myth that once they start, they can't stop. No, they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been amazing. You have been so generous with your time. We can forget about the other one because you've just been wonderful. I'm not going to make you sit here for 2 hours, but I really appreciate it. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about the book, about the case? Like, again, I can't tell you enough. Like, I was so impressed by it. And the reason why is because it's so hard to be vulnerable like that. I think especially for men. I mean, it's hard for women too. And I can see you really were. Not only do people, like, I can't count on my hands how many detectives, cold case detectives that I've talked to, who their watershed moment was in 2018 when the news came out about, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, could I do this with my cases? And then you have the book where you're sharing your personal experiences, and it's not all roses and whatever, it's life, right? And now you're helping a bunch of other people in a different way than you probably ever imagined. So I think that's great, I guess is what I'm saying.
My life has been surreal since D'Angelo was arrested. For me, I just feel like a retired county employee, but I've been given a certain amount of public notoriety, in part because of the success of the Golden State Killer case. My hope is, of course, with the book and the attention that my book has gotten, that looks like that's going to lead into some positives about not only law enforcement professionals recognizing that they need to get help, to help deal with what they are experiencing during their jobs, but also to give the average person outside of law enforcement a better understanding that we're not RoboCops. You know, we're people, and we're impacted, you know, by what we do on many levels. You know, and so that, I think, is a message that I want to get out there. And you know, it's I'm back in the game. I'm now an investigator with Othram, you know, which basically has taken the technology that we use to solve the Golden State Killer case and has just poured a ton of resources to optimize that technology. And that tool has proven to be revolutionary. I didn't invent the tool. You know, I just recognized that tool could solve a case, as did Barbara, as did Steve Kramer and other members of the team. Anne Marie Schubert, the SAC DA, who supported it. And really, it was the group of us that in many ways helped revolutionize law enforcement.
Absolutely. Well, this has been great, and I so appreciate it.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Carolyn.
Before I let you go, I want to highly recommend Paul Hull's memoir, Unmasked: My Life Solving America's Cold Cases. But we're not done yet. Stick around, because up next we have our bonus episode on criminal mischief. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will dig into the case, details that didn't make it into the episode, among other things. And if you enjoy the show, please take a minute to head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review Criminal Mischief. Tell a friend about us. It really helps. And as always, thank you so much for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself. Music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.